Now, Christianity came to the British Isles by the second Christian century. It was brought by monks who read and spoke Latin, and it was the old Latin version that they made use of in their work. And so the fact of Christianity in our world has been here a long time. Christianity in the British Isles received a great deal of impetus when Augustine, to be distinguished from the theologian Augustine, who was in North Africa at Hippo, but came and landed on the coast of our British Isles in 690 A.D. He brought the version of Jerome, which is the Vulgate version at that time, and so a great deal of progress was made at that period. There's a story how that Bede, the church historian, in the last days of his life was making a translation into the language of that time of the Gospel of John. And his writer reminded him that he just had one sentence left behind. And so he finished that sentence, and then shortly after that, his death took place. Well, there are no fragments that remain from this early period. But it is not until we get around to the 14th century then that the translation that we would have at the present time began to take shape. And so by that time, the language had developed enough, but it no longer was Anglo-Saxon as it had been before, but in the early stages of English would have taken place. So John Wycliffe is given credit for being the first person to make a translation into the English of his day. Now this would be about equal to the time of Chaucer. Way back in your earlier classes someplace, you may have heard something like, "When that a prelude with the shore so to the dose of Marty Peart to the roti," it only goes in that way. So you see, we wouldn't be able to read very much of a Bible if it still was in the form that it was at that period of time. Wycliffe's translation went through another edition, and John Purvey is given credit for having been the reviser at this period of time. Now, Wycliffe participated in the major church quarrels that were going on at that period of time, in particular England's quarrel with the papacy. And he developed a group of followers who were known as the Lollards. Somebody said about this, if you met two people in England at this period of time, one of them would be a Lollard. So it shows it had a great deal of popularity at that period of that time. In the last couple of centuries ago, this translation was written into print. There was only a manuscript Bible in the early days. Today, if you want to get a copy of Wycliffe's translation in print, you can do so. It's on the market and available in that way. But printing had not been invented in the time of Wycliffe. There wasn't any other way to duplicate material except just to do it by manuscript type of copying. A local church council passed the rule in Britain that nobody was to be able to translate into English except they had the permission of the bishops. So this is the reason it took so long to get an English Bible for reading it at that time. The bishops never got around to making a Bible, and they also didn't get around to giving anybody else permission to do so. Wycliffe's bones were eventually dug up and burned, and then the ashes thrown into the River Swift. Some English person said that the Swift flowed into the next river, and that river flowed into the ocean, And in that same way, Wycliffe's influence had gone throughout the world, despite the fact that he himself had. Now, between Wycliffe and the next important person, some important things happened in the world. And one of the most important of these was the fact that with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, or to the Arab peoples, then scholars came west, bringing their manuscripts along with them. And so people in England became aware of the fact that there was a language by the name of Greek. It had been used earlier. And the manuscripts of the Greek Bible were earlier than those of the Latin Bible. So the universities in Britain began to teach Greek, and this is an important step before the next translation took place. Also, during this period of time, then the copying of books by print was helped along with the invention of printing. And so Gutenberg came up with what is known as the Gutenberg Bible at this period of time. It's also is in reproduction on the market if one would like to have a copy of the way that Bible went. It was a Latin Bible still. Now, if you went to Washington, D.C., and had a look in the reading room at its entrance to the Library of Congress, you'd find on one side of the door a display of the Gutenberg Bible. And you'd find on the other side of that same door a manuscript Bible of that period of time. One of the striking things is that the printed Bible letters were copied after the manuscript letters. And if somebody didn't tell you that one of them is printed and the other is manuscript, you wouldn't know that's true. It's exactly in exactly the same sort of way. But this did to book printing at that time about the same sort of thing that really a computer has done in our own time. Books now became available in abundance. You could have more than one book that looked exactly like the other book did, because of course, being printed by type. And it brought the price of books down so that people would be able to afford books. And so that changed the whole way of transferring information, just like the computer's done in our own time. Now, as these various activities had their influence on the British people. So we move along and we find that then the next person of importance is William Tyndale. Tyndale was trained in Greek in the universities of Britain, and then became I guess you'd say a tutor for rich men's children, and got a position of doing that. And in a conversation with another person, the other man insisted that the nation would be better off with the Pope's law than they would be with the information that came out of the Bible. This touched off Tyndale, and he said if God spared him before long, he'd make the boy that drives the plow, and would do more about the Bible than this church figure did. They made a statement of that sort. So he moved to London and became a tutor for the children of the Bishop of London, hoping that that'd be a place where he could do translation. But he discovered that there was no place there either for that kind of work. So he went abroad to do his translating work and came out with the first printed New Testament that has come down to us. And this was shipped back into England from abroad. Tyndale was opposed by Sir Thomas More, and there would be a correspondence or exchange between these two figures. More said that you would do just as well to hunt for water in the sea as to hunt for errors that had been made in Tyndale's translation. It was a rather sharp type of exchange that took place. And ultimately then, Tyndale was burned at the stake in what today would be Western Europe, and died with a prayer on his lips, the Lord would open the King of England's eyes. His New Testament had come out in 1525, and then went through a revision in 1534, and then a couple of years later was the time of the death of this very noble figure. But, of course, we have back on the display, starting on what is my right-hand side, a facsimile copy of an opening of that New Testament. Now, the first printed Bible came along by just a few years after the time of Tyndale, and it's known as the Coverdale Bible. There are a couple of folders back there on this particular Bible. Coverdale didn't know any Greek, so his Bible was made from the Latin Bible, but made into English. And it had a rather interesting addition that, for us at least, that it also included the Apocrypha as a section following the Old Testament in it. Coverdale did furnish an introduction in which he pointed out the difference in authority between the Old Testament books and this material he put in between the two. Now, both the Greek manuscripts and the Latin manuscripts had the Apocryphal books in them, but they were scattered out through the Old Testament at various places and not collected together as was done at this time. Coverdale made a contribution in this way that went through the entire printings of English Bibles down through the King James Version. In 1611, the King James Version came out with an Old Testament, and then a introductory page that announces the Apocrypha, and the word Apocrypha is at the top of each page of this collection, and then of course it comes into an end prior to the setting up of the New Testament as the third part of that. Most of us have not been aware of the fact that the original King James Bible did have the Apocrypha as a section in between the two Testaments. And the people that go around with the bumper stickers on their car, it's not the King James Bible, it's not the Bible, would not necessarily be people that are pushing the Apocrypha for people to read. But we'll not mention this again, but just remind you that all those that came after had something to do with the Apocrypha. Now, following Coverdale, translations came out in Britain in rapid succession, one with the other. It was a rather interesting time because Tyndale's death preceded the issuing of the Coverdale Bible by just about a year. And it also preceded the giving of permission for Bibles to be circulated in the churches and used in the churches of England. Henry VIII gave authority for. Now, Thomas More refused to recognize Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England, and he paid with it with his life for that. As you probably know already, the Catholic Church has made a saint out of him as time has gone along. So it'd be now St. Thomas More. But this is the controversy in which he got his reputation that ended up in that sort of way. he was followed by what is known as the Matthew's Bible. Under pseudonym Thomas Matthew, it's thought that John Rogers was the editor of this particular translation. And that came out at about 1537. You'll notice that there's a very rapid sequence of Bibles issued at this period of time. And so they come thick and fast. But it is also at in this general period that authorization for having a Bible was issued by the king that was ruling at that period of time. That is, of course, Henry VIII. And so today, people talk about the Authorized version, which is a rather interesting thing. We don't have any record of historical record where there ever was issued an authoritative decree that the Bible could be used. Somehow it's picked up that term along the way, and it meant, of course, authorized to be used in the churches of England. In a country like America, there's no such thing as an authorized version other than just popular usage, in that we have no authority that has the standing that they could issue an authorization. A group of people might authorize the use of a Bible for a particular congregation or a particular denomination, but no other denomination would be obligated to recognize that decree of authority. So you see, we have something that can't take place, and people talk about something that can't take place when they talk about the authorized version. It was authorized, we think, for use in the Church of England. But I think I've just said there is no historical record of such an authorization ever having been issued. And exactly how it got to that term, we don't really know. We might wish that we did. But we're at Thomas Matthew at this period of time. Now, I don't have a display back in the back of this Bible, but time went along, and we get to then 1539. It was at that time that Richard Taverner did his translation, but also on that same year, the Bible that's known as the Great Bible was issued. And it overshadowed Taverner so that he isn't known by a lot of people. But there are a few things that he made in contribution to the ongoing development of the English Bible. The Great Bible was edited by Coverdale and his associates once again. And it came out in 7 different printings in rather rapid succession. If one was seeking to have examples of all of the Bibles, he'd try to have as much influence or information about the Great Bible as perhaps any of those that went before. Now, when Elizabeth when Mary had come to the throne of England, it became unhealthy for certain church leaders to remain in Britain. So a great many people sought refuge on the continent of Europe from the persecutions of the woman that's known as Bloody Mary at that period of time. And so they studied in Geneva, Switzerland. And one of the contributions that's lasting that they made is that they translated the Bible into English once again. And it is known as the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was printed in smaller size than the Great Bible was. So it becomes really a portable Bible at that time. And its popularity is due to the fact that people could carry it around as we carry our Bibles today. And it went through 144 different printings before it finally came to its last one in 1644. And that's sort of the record for all of these that came at this early period of time. Not only did the Geneva Bible have come out in portable size, but also it had a very abundant use of notes, commenting on what Scripture had to say. And it seems that people like the notes as much as they like the text at this period of time. It's distinguished by all these notes that came to the fore. Now, the Church of England was threatened by the popularity the Geneva Bible was developing. So in 1563, and the Bishop of Canterbury invited the various bishops to make a translation of their own. So using the materials that had been translated before, as well as new materials, then what is known as the Bishop's Bible came out. Now, you need to realize that the apostrophe comes after the S and not before it in this case. It wasn't a Bible by one bishop. It was a Bible where all the bishops had been invited to participate. When I say all, I mean all of those that were participated were invited. Thomas, or the Bishop of Canterbury, set the invitation to people. They were to make use of what Bibles had been done before, but also to make a new translation. And unlike the Bibles before, this one, in the end of the books, had the initial of the person that had done the translation, which meant a certain amount of responsibility that these various bishops had. It also was different from those that went before, in that it had numbered verses that earlier Bibles did not have. You may wonder, well, how did people distinguish locations in the Bible without knowing any chapters and verses as sort of arrangement? Well, if you get to look at the manuscript, you'll see that there's A, B, C, D down the side of the page. So you see, you could cite a book with, and then cite where it is by the ABC that you have on that particular page. So it was different. This Bible has some interesting things in it. The book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12 says, "Lay your bread on wet faces, and it'll return to you in many days." Now, I don't know how it got that way, but what the cause was gave that interesting reading. But there it is. It had some notes, but not nearly as extensive as those that the Geneva Bible had. And one of the interesting notes in the Old Testament is dealing with one of the islands that the Old Testament mentions, and the note says that Columbus discovered this kind of island over in America, and which is just an interesting sidelight thrown in at that particular time. It came out in 1568 AD, and promptly went through the second edition by 1569. And evidently the person that had done the book of Psalms did it so poorly that in 1569 the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, carried both the Psalms by the translator and also the Psalms out of the Great Bible. There was 2 copies of the book of Psalms at that period. And from that time on, the Bishop's Bible dropped the translation that its translator had made and carried only the Great Bible Psalms from that period. The Great Bible Psalms also became the book of Psalms cited in the British Prayer Book. And interestingly enough, that lasted down to our own time. Just a few years ago, there was a revision of the prayer book, but the Great Bible had been used that way for that long period of time. The Great Bible wasn't printed again after the Bishop's Bible came out. It had its last printing at that period of time. But the Bishop's Bible went through 19 different editions before its last printing came out in 1602. And it has a great deal of interest for us, though nobody's going to try to argue that it's the best early English translation that was made. It's rather to be judged more by the influence it had on the King James. But 1562 was its last printing. Now, Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. The Elizabethan period was the time of the great literary figures that people talk about so often. And of course, coming to the fore at this celebration year that is taking place. And so William Shakespeare in his plays would be citing the Bishop's Bible. That's where Shakespeare's influence came in. Shakespeare died in 1516, only 5 years after the King James had been made. But most of his work would have been done prior to that period of time. And this influence is that way. This also would be the time in which Spenser did the Fairy Queen as another literary item of that time. So when you talk about the great literary contribution of the King James Bible, don't forget that some pretty important literary figures appeared before the King James ever was issued. Now, after the death of Elizabeth, it was thought important to make another translation of the Bible. So when King James VI of Scotland first came to Britain to be James I of Britain, he was presented with a petition that had 1,000 signatures on it, usually called the Gutenberg Petition. This was a signing of a petition made by the Puritans with their controversies against the Church of England as it existed at that period of time. So a conference was called with the new king at Hampton Court, and so the Hampton Court Conference is a high point in the history of the Bible. The king was presented with the task of deciding how the Church of England was going to go. And at this conference, and the minutes of the conference have been printed and they're available, King James made clear that his policy was going to be that of uniformity in the Church of England, and not the kind of things that the Puritans were asking for when they insisted that the established church was not doing what their Bible said that it ought to be done. King James boasted the fact that he had met the Puritans and he'd given them slacking. And that really was the way it worked out. He didn't grant what they were asking. Now, at that conference then, having failed to gain the things he was asking for, then the Puritan leader proposed the fact that they have a new translation made. And to everybody's surprise, King James responded favorably to that. He insisted that he had never seen a Bible that was well done, but the next sentence is that all of those that he had ever seen, the Geneva Bible was the worst one. Well, that's what the Puritans wanted. And that was the Bible they were making use of. So, you see, he both slapped them and granted at the same period of time. Now, the Bishop of London proposed that if everybody had the privilege of making a new translation, there'd be no end of translations. But the king did not take up that particular statement, but proposed that they have a new translation that would be made by the best scholars in Britain, with universities participating in the translation, as well as any other known scholar that was not in the universities that could make a contribution in this sort of way. Now, if the translation had been made following the proposals that King James laid down, it would have been a good translation that is being made. But there's some gaps in the knowledge that we have of things that were possibly taking place at this period of time. So we don't have all that we know. The conference didn't really make a big imprint in its contemporaries. Parliament met from March, pardon me, I meant to say the conference was on the 16th of January, but Parliament met March to July without even a hint of any concern in this particular way. There also was the gathering of the authorities of the Church of Canterbury at this same period of time. And here again, no hint of the king's decree. But behind the scenes, things were taking place so that they began to pick out the people that were to participate. And in the end, 54 scholars are supposed to have been chosen, with 3 places at their gathering to be. One of them is at Oxford, one of them at Cambridge, and the third one then at the location of the church in town, London. And so behind the scenes, things were taking place. Now, since King James was new in England, it is logical to suppose that other people made the suggestions of who it was that was supposed to do this work. We actually have only 47 names of people that you can be sure that they were a part of the process that was taking place. And behind the scenes, they had begun the work that they were doing. There were 2 groups meeting at Oxford, 2 groups meeting at Cambridge, and 2 groups meeting at the other center. Each one had been assigned the section of the Bible that it was to work on at this period of time. But promptly there was a problem. It was estimated that it would take £1,000 to be able to pay the expenses of this project. The king was bankrupt by one maybe excessive type of living. The banks wouldn't loan him any money anymore. So as far as is known, King James never contributed one small coin toward the making of this Bible that has only had his name for all of these 400 years. It seems that the schools furnished room and board for the people that were working on their campus, and that the various workmen received no remuneration for their time and their labor during this period. Finally, there was also a group of overseers to go over the work that had been done. And they were paid 30 shillings a week for the work that they had to do. It is thought that the printer probably was responsible for the money that went to these people. Now, the printing Bibles in England was a crown monopoly at this period. And so the right to print this Bible came to the person that had printed Geneva Bibles prior to this period of time, and as far as it had been printed in England. And Barker is the name of the printer. But that seems to be about what's available about the finances of carrying out this period of work. There is a report in the remains of John Selden describing how a committee would have proceeded in this project. Selden says that a person that knew Greek, Hebrew well, then was reading the Bible that they had before. It had already been agreed that the bishop's Bible was to be used and only changed where it was not in agreement with the original Hebrew or the original Greek. So reading from these unbound leaves of the 40 copies that the printer had furnished, then reading aloud, there were other members of his committee who had in their hands copies of the Bible in French, German, Spanish, or whatever they were competent in. And as he read along, if there was no comment, why, they passed on along. If there was a comment, they stopped to deal with that particular problem and arrived at a setting of what would go to the next committee. Now, already it seems that the idea of having a committee translation rather than a single person translation really goes back to the bishop's Bible. All the Bibles before that time have been the work of one prime individual. But here you see, all 47 of these people responsible for what's going along. Now, people have written biographies of these figures in as far as they are now available for us. And first, there was a person by the name of McClure who attempted this task. And then again, more toward our time, a man by the name of Payne set his hand to this. And in the 1900s, or the 20th century, a lady by the name of Ophel did this same sort of task. So from letters, all kinds of sources of information, then the career and identity of these people was brought to people's attention. As time went along, it would be natural that there would be deaths and the need of replacement for the person who passed away. We're not always sure of who was replacing whom at this period of time. But in the literary remains of these people, there'd be notes that would be left behind. And so they were at work. Now, to show you where we are in history, in 1588, Britain overcame the Spanish Armada, and thereby the danger of invasion that had built up this time and passed away. In 1607, the first permanent colony in America, the Jamestown colony, was established. And you see, that's right during the time the King James Version was being made. And the evidence for it going on along the way would be in the lives of these people that were participating in what had taken place. It is ironical that this is the year that John Reynolds, the proposer of the new version, passed away. And in 1610, Dan Bancroft, who was the Bishop of London that had opposed the translation, but then came back to propose that they didn't have any notes in it, passed away. So these early figures, you see, were not to see what came out finally at the end. Now, a few years ago, in 1604, the Knight Institute of the American Bible Society had a symposium in New York on the beginning of the making of the King James Version. And the papers of this symposium have been published and under the title of Translation Opens the Window, and published by the Society of Biblical Literature. but you can see what people had to say back at that period of time. But this is just a part, I guess only a few, of the multitude of books that have come to light on this 400th year of the King James Version to mark what has taken place. Well, finally the book was ready, but I meant to say beforehand, only one of these 40 manuscripts now has survived and been identified in the libraries of Great Britain. And this manuscript has, when I say manuscript, it's printed leaves of the Bishop's Bible, but on the margin there are handwritten notes. And it is a thought that that would be notes made by the people that use that translation as their guide as this discussion then was going on. Now, the historians would point out that 15 different rules were drawn up to guide the revisers in the work that they were doing. And rule number 3 and number 4 declared that the theological words that had been used in the preceding translations was to be retained in this new translation. And one item that might be of interest to us is that baptizo and its related words already in the 2nd century had been translated as baptize and baptism. Somebody sent me a note some time ago that why did the King James people use baptize? They must have known that this word means to dip or to submerge the water. Well, the answer to their question is the King James Version people didn't create that translation. They inherited it from the Latin Bible that had gone before them. And they didn't, with the King's instructions, they didn't change that accepted theological word. We could also take up other words that would fall in that category. So you see, this meant that the translation was to be one that would not be out of harmony with the way that the British Church had come to be at that period of time. Also, Rule 3 and 4 suggested that the use of terms that had been in the Church Fathers would be maintained in this translation, and that would have the same effect. The king was interested, it seems, in maintaining the royal right of kingship. So if you read the King James Bible, you'll see that there are certain passages in the Old Testament where people are saying, God save the king. Well, there's no Hebrew that goes that way. But you see, that's what British people were saying in Britain at that period of time. And so it was made that way. You also will discover that in Paul's writings, you have God forbid about 14 or more times it takes place. Well, in Greek, that term has no word for God in it. It's just a strong emphatic negative that's being set forth. So something like by no means is what is being said by Paul at that time. But you see, both of these would have import in the religions of that period of time. But by 1611, then the work was ready, having been done in this sort of way. And I jumped over one translation earlier that I should have mentioned, and of course that's the Reims-Jewish Bible, which is a Catholic Bible at this period. New Testament came out in 1588, but they didn't have enough money to publish the Old Testament, and so it was only 1610 when it came out. This meant that it had very little influence on the King James Bible. There's a book by Butterfield that gives you a percentage of the contribution made by each one of these earlier Bibles to the King James Bible, you'll find that a very heavy percentage is attributed back to William Tyndale and his work. Over this period of time, it was just maintained on into the King James Bible. You'll find, and for me this is strange, that the Bishop's Bible, which the rules said were to be followed, comes out with only 4% of its contribution going into the King James translation. But I think you have to remember that this doesn't include what they passed on from what had been done before them. It is the unique contribution is what we're talking about with this sort of percentage set forward. So you see, it didn't come out quite as much like the Bishop's Bible as the instructions suggest that maybe it should have. But anyhow, finally in 1611, it was all ready to be set forth to the public. Now, strangely enough, the 1611 printing of this Bible came out with a peculiarity that has puzzled people all since that period of time. And it has to do with the book of Ruth in chapter 3. And after this interview between Ruth and Boaz, somebody went into town. And one printing of 1611 says she went into town, that he's going home. And the other says that he went into town. Well, you see, just one letter, whether you include S or don't include S, is the difference in this case. Now, logically, I think you have to say that the only person that wanted to go into town was Ruth in this case. So it had to be she went to town. But on the other hand, it is the opinion today that he was the way it came out to start with, that he went into town. And this is known as the Great She Bible and the Great He Bible by this slight difference takes place at this period of time. Well, as the King James came out, it had to make its way, like other English Bibles since that period of time have done. Thomas Fuller, a British church historian, says that the brothers were not satisfied with the translation. Now, if you think about who might be criticizing, first would be the Catholics. And so we go through a period in which people are struggling between Catholic and non-Catholic Bibles. So obviously they had bad things to say. If you look on the other side, Hugh Broughton comes out with the most shocking type of thing. Broughton had not been invited to participate in the translation, though he was a well-known scholar at that period of time. His personality was such he was hard to work with. Broughton said that this would disturb him as long as he lived, that he'd rather be tied between wild horses and torn apart rather than allow anything like that to go forth among the people. But despite such objections, and still, it went forth to become the popular Bible that it's been for these many, many years since that period of time. I think we need to call attention to the fact that, the 1611 Bible is not like a King James Bible that you would buy today. And I'm talking about editorial matters in the Bible. Across the years, there have been 5 different identifiable revisions of the King James Bible. The notes have been changed or revised, and when you have a Bible that has dates at the top of the page of the Old Testament, like creation in 4004 BC, that came in along the way. And these are just examples of what happened in this revision that took place. And so, you see, you say only the King James Bible. Well, do you mean the 1611 Bible? Or do you mean the ones that are available today? Now, besides that, if you've got yourself a copy of 5 or 6 King James Bibles by different printers, you'd find that an Oxford Bible is not exactly like a Cambridge Bible. And the Oxford and Cambridge Bibles are not exactly like Zondervan's Bibles would be, the King James Version. And Zondervan's Bibles would not be exactly like those that come out of Nashville with the printing run at that place. I'm not talking about the general teaching and the general content, but I'm talking about details of punctuation, capitalization, and things of that sort. So what do you mean by the King James Bible? Which one of these are you talking about? The 1611 one or the 2011 one? And that's a rather interesting and important question. But you can, by careful comparison, come up with these details that show that people have made changes along the way. I'm not trying to say that the general content has been drastically modified. But these things that I have to say are not intended to put a blot upon the 400th year that we're celebrating, and the fact that the King James Version's made a contribution to English culture that no other translation has made or ever will make. Our present-day translations will not last 400 years in the way that this one has. There was a 300-year celebration 100 years ago. And at that time, a small-sized King James was printed up. Besides that, a book was gathered together that had many of these details, the documents of the history of the Bible and the way that I've been talking about. So my main study has been the examination of various translations for their understandability as well as their reliability to the ordinary person in the pew at the present time. Not what scholars can find out, but you see, what the ordinary person reading his